wanted to start by sharing this story from several years ago. I was working with a young patient with addiction, opiate addiction, and he was narrating his story to me. He was maybe late teens, early 20s. But he had recently come to us from a stay in critical care in the hospital. During a previous hospitalization, he was introduced to a woman who was being treated for depression. And as she heard his story about his misadventures with heroin, the thought came to her so strongly that she had never felt happy a single day in her life. Her depression had just dominated her entire existence. And the wish was so strong in her to just know what that could feel like, to have an elevated mood for once in her life. Nothing seemed to be working. Treatment didn't seem to be working. And so when they were both out of treatment, she reached out to this young man and asked for his help in using. And he's like, no, I can't do that. He's like, I'm finally getting sober and I won't have any hope of getting better if I do this for you. And she said, you don't have to use, I'm going to do this either way. And so if you don't help me, it's certainly going to be a lot more dangerous or complicated for me. So finally, he caves in. And as he's going to meet her, she's saying, I'll pay for it, I'll drive, just help me figure out how to do this. I want to feel this. And as he's going to meet her, he just feels so hopeless about himself in the situation, and he decides, you know what, I'm going to use too. But he's going to kill himself that day. He's going to intentionally overdose. So they make their way to the connection to get drug. And then he shows her how to use it and sets her up with what in his mind is the safest dose. And then he proceeds to overdose. Well, he falls into a coma, wakes up 3 days later in the hospital, and the doctors are telling him how much of a miracle it is that he's even alive, and then he had like less than 1% chance of being able to regain his memory and to full functioning of his brain. But all that came back, and as he started to put this puzzle back together, then he remembered where he was and who he was with, and he said, where's that woman I was with? Is she okay? And the doctors informed him that she died in from that one use. And and then he came to me and we started to work together. But I feel like that story just exemplifies how bizarre and complex and tragic the opioid crisis is in America. 70,000 Americans die now each year from opiate overdose, which is like twice as many as car accident deaths. And this term addiction is really complicated because we use it in conventional speech in a lot of different ways. We say our country is addicted to oil and fossil fuels. We say people are addicted to video games and addicted to TV and addicted to food. And it gets pretty confusing, and it's, as a condition, it is very multi-dimensional. I'm just going to touch on a few of them to add some context to addiction. In 1980, our country had about the same rate of incarceration as all the other developed nations of the world. From then till now, America has incarcerated more people than any other country, than so many other countries combined. Our population represents 4% of the world, but we have 20% of the incarcerated people of the world. And much of that is due to the 1980 launch of the war on drugs, which has disproportionately affected minorities. In the 18th century, there was 600,000 Africans kidnapped and brought to America in the slave trade. Today, there are over 2 million blacks in the prison system, whether incarcerated or on probation or jail and so on. It's a strange statistic to think that there are more black people in under correctional supervision than 18th century slave trait. There's also a lot of other research that shows that whites and blacks, in terms of just the last time they used an illicit drug, it's pretty similar. But black people are incarcerated like 6 times more than white people, are arrested 6 times more than white people. So there's this cultural problem associated with it. When we're thinking about what are the models for addiction, and is it a disease, I think that model works. But why do people say it's not a disease? Well, because there's a lifestyle component to it. They say, well, people are choosing to do this, they've done this to themselves, and they didn't have to do it. And I would push back on that by saying that many diseases have a lifestyle component, but they don't have the same kind of stigma associated with it. I mean, there's a lifestyle component to diabetes, right? What we choose, how we choose to eat, and our nutritional content can affect the development of that disease. And yet, even though there's a lifestyle component, we still consider it a disease. Some cancers may have lifestyle component. Consuming processed meats like bacon daily increase your risk of colon cancer by 67%. And colon cancer is already the most common cancer. But you wouldn't find a doctor saying, this isn't real because you did this to yourself.
Right.
Or calling it a bacon abuse disorder. Or telling the patient, 3 strikes and you're out, we can't treat you anymore. I mean, in a lot of psychiatric care, there are contracts, behavioral contracts. I always had a hard time accepting behavior contracts, because that is actually what the disease is. The disease, at least the brain part of this, includes disruption to decision making. And it is a disease of willpower. So you're almost setting patients up for shame and failure by giving them behavioral contracts. And so I think it does fit into a disease model. Then what would be the stages? Well, stage 1, at least on a psychosocial level, stage 1 could be like experimental use. Most people experiment with drugs and alcohol at some point, and it never becomes much of a problem from there for many people. But if you think about what happens in stage 1, there are many positives. Usually people are having fun, they're with friends, they don't have to pay for it, they don't get in trouble. Now, I had a friend in college when we were 18, we were at a party, a bunch of underage drinking going on. The police in DC raided the party, started handcuffing kids. My buddy got arrested and thrown in the back of a squad car. And this was one of the first times, I mean, at least in college, that we were like, as adults on our own, partying. But he got out of the squad car when the cops were getting other kids, ran off. Some other people helped him get the cuffs off. They tossed him in a sewer. And when the cops came back and saw he was gone, they went after him. They caught up with him. And all they really wanted to know is, where are the handcuffs? Because it's probably a lot of paperwork to explain why there's no cuffs. They ended up charging him with a felony. He spent multiple weeks in prison before his family could get it sorted out. He was so traumatized by that incident that he never used again. Now, I say this because the primacy effect matters in the development of addiction. Just take a weekend of binge drinking and reorder the sequence of events that are likely to happen. Imagine somebody takes a drink and the first thing that happens is they start puking, they have flu-like symptoms, migraine, and that slowly dissipates over 24 hours until the next afternoon they feel kind of buzzed and good and loose for 15 minutes. Who would drink? But because that comes later, the brain can so strongly associate with the initial experience. And that is also the case over time with these stages of addiction. The primacy effect matters in this experimental use if it's very positive, but people might make that strong association. The second stage could be considered regular use of some kind. Now in the beginning, there's no pattern whatsoever. Kid gets offered something, but usually it starts out with a little bit of force, and we call that force peer pressure. And in regular use, you don't need as much peer pressure. But still, the person using is not likely to be getting into trouble, not likely spending their own money, and so on, still having positive experiences, still with friends, not going to do it while they're behind the wheel or at school, until the third stage, which is considered risky use. After enough positive experiences in these first two stages, a young person may start to use in riskier situations, at school or at work, behind the wheel. Now they're paying for it. Now they might be getting their first consequences. But if it continues to develop, it means those aren't enough to undo all the positive experiences that already have been felt. This also applies in relationships. Relationships can become highly dysfunctional, but the beginning of any relationship is usually very positive and loving and romantic, and otherwise there wouldn't be a relationship. So even after things become really chaotic, people will not leave them necessarily because they know that the beginning was beautiful and they're still living off of that initial investment, but it eventually starts to come down and go bankrupt, and if people don't recognize it, they can find themselves in a cycle of dysfunction and abuse. And then this fourth stage would be dependence, where a person is no longer using with others, they need to use alone, because they're tired of people saying, hey, you might want to watch your drinking there, or I think you've had enough. They're tired of that. And maybe finally they just break out of that and just use in their own space. And that's when it really grows into a serious problem, because addiction is a disease of disconnection, social disconnection, a disease of loss of meaning, a disease that attacks human values. And you may have seen this famous TED Talk by Johann Hari, or read one of his books, like Lost Connections, that talks about this dimension a lot with addiction, the psychosocial, cultural dimension. And he narrates this important study known as Rat Park. So up until the 70s, scientists had observed that rats in a cage, when given a choice between two sources of water, regular water and heroin-infused water, they will always choose the heroin water until they die. This seemed to inform our understanding of addiction and dependence. You get exposed enough, and then you get hooked. And that stuff has got such addictive properties, you just got to stay away from it. Well, another scientist came along and said, but that's not actually how rats live, so how much can we really draw from this experiment? So he recreated this study with a cage that was 200 times the size of the previous ones, and he called it Rat Park. He filled the cage with cheese, other rodents, and everything that a rodent would want, a rat would like. It can have friends, and it can have sex, and it has plenty of food, but still two sources of water. Same two sources of water are there. Heroin-infused water and regular water. But in Rat Park, the rodents never drink the heroin water. Or if they do, they never develop a dependence on it. And so the takeaway from this is that we shouldn't just be asking people about what they're hooked onto. We need to understand what is their cage. We're asking people, what is your cage? And I think this speaks to why there are these cultural imbalances with respect to addiction. We know that there is a high rate of alcohol use among the Native American population, but the reservations are in isolated regions. People don't have access to health care. There's extreme poverty. Researchers describe it as third world conditions. And so with all that loss of meaning, the mind is going to bond to something. That's what Johann Hari is saying, that there's always going to be bonding. And if we don't have bonding with purpose and our people and meaning in life, then we may bond with something else, a substance or behavior or a pattern. So I think this is really fascinating. But of course, there's more layers to this, and I really want us to dive in our conversation, because this affects everybody for sure. 20 million Americans have a substance use disorder. Only 10% get treatment. So there's some big gap, some stigma. And part of that is just the context. Because like I said, in 1980 we launched the war on drugs, but in the 20th century, to smoke cigarettes was attractive. Now it's unattractive, and there's stigma associated with that. Marijuana is still a Schedule I drug federally, an illicit drug that has no medicinal properties according to its schedule. Meanwhile, states all over the country are moving to legalization. And so what was once a crime is now socially accepted. And this is a really confusing topic all in itself, so I'll just touch on it briefly. But three things get conflated with cannabis. One is legalization, the legalization for recreational use. Second, decriminalization, not legalizing, but reducing sentencing and trying to guide people into rehabilitation. And thirdly is medicinal use, which is just mostly silly to me. Not that I don't think pot can help people cope with pain and other things, but just that the way we treat it in the system. Now, allopathic medicine, Western medicine, doesn't give people whole plants for their condition. That would be like sending somebody to an elm tree farm with a 3-year prescription for bark there, because there's aspirin in that, and that will really help your headaches. No other direction. And now, you know, Illinois is moving to full legalization, which I would prefer over medicinal use, because when they launched medical marijuana in Illinois, they called it the Compassionate Pilot Act or something like that. And who would you think would need this the most to cope with pain? Like, what age segment of the population would you think needs the most help with treating pain?
Seniors.
Yes, seniors. But over 50% of the recipients were between the ages of 18 and 34 nationally. And so I looked at one of the dispensaries in Naperville back when the medical program launched to see what the medicine was. And the first one is called Alien Rock Candy. And others are called Bio Jesus, Grape God Bud. And it's no wonder that seniors don't go there. It's not in the regular pharmacy. It's a joke, you know. So I'm not saying that there's no benefits and that you can't derive or extract compounds from the plant and make medicine like we do with all other medicine. But I don't see anything compassionate about sending a senior citizen to a dispensary and ask them to order Grape God Bud for their glaucoma. But I do see it throughout the country as just simply a step for the business people to help make it socially acceptable so they can push their full agenda. And the other thing to consider with full legalization is this. It's not just about freedom. Because I've never known any of my white friends to have a problem with being free enough to smoke pot. Almost all my friends have smoked pot, and almost none of them have ever been in trouble for it. But when you legalize something, you're also green-lighting corporations to advertise to children. And that's really what we need to be concerned about. Of course, it's complex. It's not black and white. You know, on one hand, you might say, but can't that reduce the influence of the black market and drug cartels in America? Maybe. But in some states where you tax what's legal and the black market can beat that price, it is actually, in some states like Oregon, the black market increased initially. Because now it's legal, so more people can use it, and it's cheaper on the black market than it is in the regulated stores. All I'm saying is this is very complicated, and context matters. If you're somebody who's wondered about what addiction feels like, and that you just cannot relate whatsoever because you know somebody and somebody in your family has hurt you so much or hurt the family so much that you just can't understand how somebody can keep making this wrong decision. Well, I say that everybody, whether you have an addiction or not, knows what it feels like. Because when people say you have a choice, I push back on that, because if you think of something like eating, most people need to eat every day. Not only do they need to eat every day, they need to eat at least 3 square meals a day. I know so many people that cannot miss a single meal. Hunger is a real thing. Getting hungry. But a human being can survive for up to 60 days without food. Yet people will not miss a single meal without losing their shit. And so when you say you have a choice, do you have a choice? So if you're one of those angry people, do you feel like you have a choice? Every cell in the body is screaming, I need to eat now before I do anything. Think of coffee in the morning. The long lines at Starbucks. Imagine if tomorrow the map changed, the cultural map, and now, for whatever reason, the government's decided coffee is illegal. How many people are going to be ready to just, like that, oh, it's illegal, then I won't use it. Oh, it's illegal, I won't drive with it. Now, of course, every drug affects differently, and these stages of development is different. Smoking, for a long time, it was just the effects were concealed. Scientists hid it because they were paid off by corporations, hid what they knew since the 20s. And it's just it's a longer trajectory. And not every disease leads to death, but addiction can lead to death, but it's different with each type of addiction, just like every cancer is different. But ultimately, I'm advocating for compassion in all of this, and I'll just summarize by echoing the words of Ram Dass. He talked about going into the woods and seeing the trees in the forest. And you see that they're all different. Some are taller, some are stronger, some are crooked. And your mind just kind of allows for all of it, because there's just an inner understanding. Well, this tree didn't have enough light, and this one grew on the side of the hill, and this one's closer to water, and so on. And you just look with an open, neutral mind, and you just appreciate it all. But as soon as we come out of the woods and we're with people, it's like we give up all of that, and we just go back to judging. This person's too that, too this. So I think we need to move away from the language of addiction. Calling people addicts is not compassion. People are people. They have different conditions, and we need to try to be loving. We may need to set boundaries, but we can still see people as people. The word abuse probably has contributed so much to why the prison population has been such dramatically increasing, because that sounds criminal. Substance abuse. So the better language is substance use disorders. And I thank you for listening to me, and I hope that we can really jump in, because like I said, I think this affects all of us. And if we can have a really open, spirited, deep conversation, I think we can help a lot of people just by this conversation today. So thank you.